In times of chaos and breakdown, where might we turn for guidance? To the myths, the storytellers, the wisdom keepers, and the rabble-rousers. To the ones braving the seas of uncertainty, not with answers, but with poetry, beauty, and well-crafted questions. I'm Ian MacKenzie, co-founder of the School of Mythopoetics, a place to gather with like-hearted folks to navigate the mysteries together. And this is The Crow's Nest, where I speak with an array of guests who are employing their mythic imagination to engage with the tempest of the times. You're invited to join me live on YouTube each week. Visit schoolofmythopoetics.com/podcast to learn more. And now, enjoy our conversation. Greetings, friends. As was stated there, I am Ian MacKenzie, and this is actually the first Crow's Nest in a little while. And it's good to be back in the saddle again, this time with my two special guests joining me together in this way for the first time as well. So I'm excited to see where we go. So we're going to jump in first with Rune Hjarnø Rasmussen is a historian of religion, Ph.D. from Uppsala University in Sweden. His research into Afro-diasporic strategies for maintaining animist reality in the modern world has led him towards reading North European cultural history from the perspective of rejected animist knowledge and practice. The objective is to recover Euro-traditional forms of land-connectedness, ecological knowledge, and kinship with the greater community of beings. Rune has lived in a number of countries in Europe, Africa, North and South America, and presently runs the platform Nordic Animism. Welcoming on Rune.
Hi there. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to see you again. Yeah, thanks, Rune. I mean, just to name two, this is I believe the second time that we've been in conversation. First with the Mythic Masculine podcast, where I think we talked about apocalypse in various ways, and then again for Into the Dark, which was our sort of Samhain storytelling gathering that we did online last October. So yeah, once again, thanks for making the time to join me here.
Yes, always a pleasure. And yeah, so that's some dark issues there. Apocalypse and darkness. Okay, but
we'll see where we go today. So I'm going to welcome on Stephen Jenkinson, a man who I've had the great pleasure and consternation of being in school, the Orphan Wisdom School, for over 10 years now. But Stephen is a spiritual activist, author, ceremonialist, and farmer. Teaches internationally and is the creator and principal instructor of the aforementioned named Orphan Wisdom School, founded in 2010. With master's degrees from Harvard University in Theology and the University of Toronto in social work. He's the author of several books, including the award-winning Die Wise, a Manifesto for Sanity and Soul, Come of Age, The Case for Elderhood in a Time of Trouble, and A Generation's Worth, among others. Stephen is the subject of the National Film Board of Canada feature-length film, the documentary Griefwalker, as well as the subject of a few shorts that I've managed to put out over the years, of which the latest was Lost Nation Road, based on the live show Nights of Grief and Mystery, co-created by Stephen and Gregory Hoskins. So welcome, Stephen, once again.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's good to see you again, and good to see you for the first time, Rune.
Yes, nice to meet you too, Stephen.
So this, there's many places this conversation could go. And, I in a bit of the conversation beforehand, there was some sense that there a lot of parallel inquiry has been happening, both, as I know, from the Orphan Wisdom School, where Stephen has invited us into really kind of tracking the threads of how North America came to be as it is, and those threads leading certainly back through across the waters to Europe in particular, and then with Rune and Rune's work of reclamation and looking at the Nordic ancestry and even making connections between cultural traditions that have a degree of sanity still intact. There seems to be a number of ways that we could navigate this conversation, but maybe with Stephen first. You just came back from the road. I understand you came back from the homelands of Rune as well, who wasn't in attendance at the time. But yeah, I wonder if that might be a place to start. Of what did you recognize there? As you've been so many places now with this tour, but also, you know, your way of seeing. I wonder what you saw.
Well, first of all, there's not many places I can go in the world, and I occasionally see somebody who looks like me. But that's one such place. That in Iceland was the other one, and Ireland to some extent. So these things are beads on a string sometimes. And so it's a wondrous thing, I have to say, being from the so-called New World, or the newer world, or what some people mistake for the New World, let's call it that, that you can travel so far from what has never really truly been your home here. And there's a sense of strange participatory affinity, let's call it that, maybe. And I had that from time to time when I was on the road in Scandinavia, and it's the first time I've been there. And it's you know, it's a great privilege to live long enough to be vaguely claimed by people so far from you. I mean, so far in distance, in geographical distance from you, without pretending that you have acres and acres of similarities between you. But there's a murmuring across time somehow that that can send the hair on the back of your neck up a little bit, not in agitation, but in some kind of strange recognition, you know, that has survived all the distance, all the ruptures in continuity of history and so on. And that truly happened. And not frequently, but enough for me to know that it wasn't an accident. So, you know, it's, well, it reminds me of a story, if I may, because I mean, I can tell we're story types, the three of us here. So enough with the ideas, but a story can carry everything, you know? So, but this really happened. It's that kind of a story that actually occurred. And I was in Iceland, maybe it feels like 5 or 6 years ago. And there was an old farmer that I met, and he, through the translator that we had together, he more or less instantly fingered me as somebody who was clearly from that part of the world, which is way up in the northern part of Iceland. And we were trying to sort of narrow it down because I have no knowledge that there's any kind of genetic connection that brings me there, just in the vaguest sense of historical washes, you could say, but nothing particular and nothing anybody's ever said. And we're trying to trace it down, you know, and we found, just in talking back and forth, a kind of, let's call her a mythic but persistent young Irish slave girl who was probably brought in the first couple of generations of settlement in Iceland. And Icelanders are quite fond of reminding us, those of us from away, that their place was settled without recourse to uprooting indigenous people. As far as we know, that's true, and it's a wondrous thing unto itself. They don't often mention, though, that they did exactly the same thing, settled the place with recourse to slavery, a chronic slavery, too. And lo and behold, didn't one of those young slave girls, this time from Ireland, produce a kind of continuity wherein this old farmer and myself recognized each other through her presence, you know, so many generations, so many centuries ago. And I mean, that feels like a living history that you can't document, but it murmurs in you, and it certainly did in me. And it's one of the reasons I was pleased to take up the offer of joining the conversation today.
I think that's a super nice opening there. I really love this cathartic murmuring across time that you experience there, and I think a lot of people are in search of that, and people are often they will be engaging different kinds of stuff from being driven towards that. For instance, you have a lot of people who involve in stuff like Viking reenactment, so they, you know, create Viking costumes. Or you also have a lot of people who are doing detectorists, so they will go out in the fields and find stuff from perhaps the Iron Age or something like that, and they're seeking that moment of catharsis where they feel that basically that the rupturing are sort of bridged somehow. Yeah, that's just my thoughts on immediate thoughts on that.
Now, Rune, you and I have talked about this almost, or essentially, like, what is the sense of belonging? I mean, of course, Stephen, you know, within the school, that's so much of what seems to bring folks to the Orphan Wisdom School. I mean, including myself, is some, you know, vague, ghosted sense of belonging and how to belong somewhere, how to belong again. And there's something, maybe in some ways, that looks back to Europe and says, because they still have it, you know, they clearly must still have it because they never left. You know, my people came from England and Ireland largely as well. And I hear Rune, you saying like, well, just hold on a second. Like, you know, do we still have it over here too? And maybe you could speak a bit about that, about what you've discovered, you know, through your research and your work there.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, well, I think that we live in a very much in a transatlantic world. And today, of course, with the internet, our reality is very much defined by North America, for instance. But that's also something that goes back in time. Notions of, I don't know, basic political notions of freedom, or like, we are very intertwined. And that also means that for instance, the colonial project of implementing whiteness on people like Gales or Norwegians and Bavarians and whatever we would have been a couple of 100 years ago, that is also something that that has happened in Northern Europe. It has happened in different ways, and it doesn't have the same. It's not identical to what you'll find in North America, but it has happened. An important part of that, I think, is that build, like the basic software that goes into making us into white people, that is, for instance, rejection of animism and a strong demand to be modern. And so in Scandinavia, Northern Europe, for instance, if you go a bit further into Scandinavia, Norway or Sweden, you find that there has been, just during the last 100 years, there's been an amazing or an incredible cultural pressure to become modern, and all that stuff about going out and giving beer to spirits in an ancient gravesite, that it's considered a little bit dirty, or something that, you know, we're not supposed to do. So in that sense, like, for instance, my father, he told me that that he saw soot. He came out on the 1st of May on some standing stones where he lived, and he saw that there was soot there. There had been a burning. People went out on that place and burned a fire in secrecy, because it was illegal in the 1950s. Now, it wasn't illegal because of Christian oppression. It was illegal probably because of like a nationalist modernity in which a cultural heritage site is supposed to be protected, and that then occludes the fact that the cultural heritage site is also an intangible cultural heritage. It's also part of what people do. So that kind of that process, I think we are all a fruit of that. And I don't think that, like, that we North Europeans are necessarily less detached from land than North Americans. We don't live on land that has been genocided into us being there, and that is an important difference. But that cultural homelessness that I understand is part of what you're talking about, Stephen. I think that is also something that is a condition that we are living on. And yeah.
Thanks, Rune. Yeah, Stephen, I wonder what might be percolating for you in hearing that.
I'm remembering a time I was particularly intemperate. You might have been there, Ian. I can't remember which class it was, but it was, I think it was one of the Beowulf sessions. And so the question of belonging and who are Europeans to North Americans and vice versa was very much in the air, right? And you may remember, if not, I'll inform you. The way it went was at a certain point, a woman who was not only Italian, but clearly happy that she was, and feeling a certain degree of, maybe superiority is too strong, but a sense of deep appreciation for the fact that she wasn't amongst the swarm of vaguely adolescent feeling North Americans in this particular session. So at some point, I did ask the question, I think more or less overtly, who are we to you? And she said something in the order of, you're kind of junior players in the national and geo-national stage, on the stage. And I don't know what prompted me to be as intemperate as I was, except my temper maybe. But this is what I said in response. I said, actually, the distinct likelihood is that we are, in fact, more European in the kind that you mean than you are. And she just looked at me and like nothing happened, because, of course, it didn't register at all. And I took that as an encouragement to elaborate. And so elaborate I did. And I'll paraphrase it now, the gist of it went something like this. So you never left, addressing the hypothetical Italian lady. You never left, your people never left, and there you are, and here you sit. And my people clearly left. And so this is the marker, who left and who didn't, as if leaving is the rupture and staying is not, which is kind of in the air and what Rune was saying a few minutes ago, I think. So there's a wonderful thing to wonder about deeply, whether staying establishes the continuity that leaving can't possibly approximate. Because I'm wondering very much in another direction here, because here's the elaboration, such as it is, and it's a fanciful one, and there's myriad exceptions, right? But from the point of view of an idea, this might be worth wondering about. So she stays, and she becomes a modern European person. In her lineage, she's the latest incarnation of something that's bordering on kind of the crypto globalization of the nuances which constitute ancestral personhood. She's clearly involved in that. That's what modern people are incarnations of globalization. And what we do about it is another thing, but certainly that's there. On the other hand, as she becomes a modern European, people where I am have no such understanding or capacity, I would say, to have become a modern European, a parallel to a modern European. And to call us modern North Americans is a bit redundant, right? Because, I mean, what other kind of North American is there but a modern one? But a modern one in the sense of what? That we might actually represent, having left 200 years ago or 3, whatever it is, we might represent a kind of maybe frozen in time, a kind of vernacular, a European vernacular that the process of modernization didn't touch, or at least for the most part left alone. And so we have these wacky accents, which when we go over there, the Europeans want us to speak. They find it compelling, particularly for Quebecois who go to France. My wife I've seen this happen to her, that she's deemed to be a kind of cute mascot person who's speaking a kind of vanished dialect that's compelling but not serious. and is dismissible and all that sort of thing. And people from the East Coast of the country have a similar experience, of course, and they go back to Scotland or Ireland. And people there find their accent to be museumish. Yeah. So this is, if any of this holds, it brings forward the notion that somehow, by virtue of our lack of being modernized as a European derivative, that we're not somehow the repository of a kind of as yet somewhat undiminished late medieval form of the thing that came to be modernized and turned into the EU, for example. I'm fond of the idea. Here's the second half, and I'm taking up a lot of time here, but I'm happy to stand down in a second. But maybe this story belongs as well. I think I was in England for the first time, teaching in England, and it was all of this stuff that we're talking about now was in the air and in my blood somehow, and it was kind of unnerving, and I didn't know what to bring. Maybe this is an Ireland story. Let's say it happened in Ireland, and two things occurred in this first session. The first one was I was just about to speak, and a late middle-aged woman from way back in the house, interrupted the proceedings and said something that by virtue of the dialect, I couldn't understand. And I had to ask her to repeat herself. Meanwhile, the whole crowd is not looking at her as they would if we were in Canada and she had interrupted in this fashion. They were all looking at me based on her having said something. And I asked her to repeat herself, and she said, look at your head. Not to imitate the accent, but that's what she said, minus the H on head, of course. Look at your head, she said. And I had no idea what that meant until years later. But at that moment, all the Irish people in the house looked at me and conferred with each other about the degree to which the shape of my head was a mark of my belonging among them. And they clearly agreed amongst themselves that it did. So once having ascertained my lineage, my cranial lineage, they just signaled to me to go on now because it's clear that I'm from among them in some fashion. Years later, I was told that phrase is actually an evocation of what they call grimly the famine head. And it's related, as they understand it, to the malnutrition that ensued some 60 years ago or something, and from the famine. And it still reproduces itself in their understanding of the physiognomy. So I'm a slight person with an oversized head, and the oversized head is an indication of the malnutrition. Well, the slight body is an indication of that, and the oversized head is something that they notice amongst themselves, as was explained to me many years later. And in the same meeting, I departed and I said, do you ever think of us? By us, I meant people from on this side of the ocean. And it was a frozen silence, which no one was really keen on. It was awkward. It was lamentable. There was a lament in the air, mostly coming from me, but not entirely, not an accusation, something subtle and forlorn. Do you ever think of us? I said. And I knew what the answer was. And they did too, and nobody wanted to say it, but finally a few people acknowledged that indeed they don't. Like basically never. And I said, understood. It's not a surprise. It doesn't come as news or a shock to me. Could you ask me now? And everybody froze again. I said, anyone, just ask me the question because I'm happy to answer it for you. And finally somebody did, do you ever think of us? And I said, every day.
Oh wow! That's there's something really telling about that. I think sometimes I sense these weird discomforts between Europeans and Americans. Sometimes Europeans have a tendency to be arrogant and accuse Americans of all kinds of stuff. But I actually think I think it's you're touching on some really interesting questions about how different kinds of modernity are built. I think that, for instance, a part of what is interesting about North Americans is that the rejection of, for instance, spirituality has been less, is less there somehow than in many European modernities. Like, my wife is French, and their rejection of, for instance, religion in their cultural space is almost aggressive. And you find a touch of the same stuff in Scandinavia, whereas in North America there is a much more, and I think you feel it in people. You feel that people have, for instance, an experiential proximity to that kind of stuff, and that's an important difference. I also think that like I communicate on a channel, on a YouTube channel, and I'm speaking a lot to Americans, I sense, and I get a lot of American reactions and basically a lot of communicating with Americans, and it kind of grew into being that way. It's not something that I particularly intended in the beginning, but it happened, and I've come to think that the particular, like, if you look at North America, it is as if the particulars of our age, of modernity, is also in some ways it's intensified in some ways, and that means I think it means that a lot of, like, I think some of the answers, like, they're gonna come from your side of the pond, basically, because North Americans, for instance, stuff like being in close proximity with hardcore colonial questions, with some of the wounds of those historic processes, to people in Denmark, that is something that's very far away. There isn't any indigenous population around. We do have a colonial relation with Greenland, but I think it is there's a bit of a different thing going on out there, and it's not, anyway, it's different. And there are also similarities, but this proximity with these questions, I think that's also why, like, a lot of, like, the intense grappling with contemporary questions, in my view, they come from Americans, like the whole masculinity considerations that people like Ian, and I think also you yourself, Stephen, are bringing up. I'm seeing more of that coming from America. People thinking about whiteness. I know some people, they're pulling in all kinds of indigenous leaders and voices to basically teach white people about how to decolonize, or how to refine connection with roots. These kind of initiatives tend to come from your side of the pond.
Mhm.
Another thing is that if we look at states like North European ethno-states like Denmark, which it has a myth of being one ethnic group living in one state, and the ethnic group coincides with the borders of the state, and they have the same religion, and they speak the same language, and everything is neat and well ordered. And of course, it's not like that. It's more complex, and there's all kinds of gray zone areas and stuff like that. But I think there's that whole image of, which is also an image of social control, which is also an image of a modernist myth that is supposed to produce us in a specific way. That it has a very different nature in North America, which is such an encounter. And I think that the Creole nature of not only of North America, but of different places in America, that has a potential to also bring out alternative spaces where we can basically become connective again in ways that will bring us to a different place. Did that make sense? The last bit I was saying there.
Mm. I could offer just a bit of weaving of some of the threads, I've been tracking and see where we go. I mean, Steve, just got to reflect one label back. I think you said crypto globalization or something. I thought was a pretty good one. I wrote that one down, the crypto globalization. But what I feel is emerging is this sense of that story you told, Stephen, of, do you think of us, right? And there's such a lament in there. It's just so, on the surface, and I even feel touched by that. And then this kind of casual dismissal in a way, well, no, don't really think of you at all. And then do you think of us? And you say every day. And it seems to be that in North America almost is like, it's kind of recognized the ghost is present in a way, like the ghosted longing is present enough to like try to hearken back in some ways, the ones that kind of awaken to it, of which there seems to be many, and trying to do different ways, try to be Vikings or something over here too, but it's there. Whereas on the flip side, say in Europe, it's like the ghost is gone, so gone that they don't know that is gone for them, but it's not present. Maybe you say even the gone is gone for them. I mean, that's echoes of that. It's kind of what I think I'm hearing. So in some ways, I'm thinking of you, Rune, like even the case, like what does it mean to belong, again, to this place for Europeans that are, quote, still there? Is that even kind of like a non-starter? That's what I guess I'm curious, is like even that case isn't being made there, because the modernity goes so deep. Yeah, that's just what's swimming up there for me.
Yeah, I think there's actually, I think it's really complex. Also, like our colonization, the ways in which we are colonized they're not unilinear. They're ways in which we are very traditionalist, or we have a lot of traditionalist culture. Like, just to give you an example, I have a book which is my grandmother's cookbook, and it is an extremely detailed manual in how to run a farmhouse in the early 20th century or late 19th century. And it goes down to, if you have a farmhouse with so many maids, then at what time of the morning do which of them need to get up to start doing this and that. And so it's, however, and that all, a lot of the stuff that's in there is actually very traditional culture. If you want to go homesteading, you could basically pick it and you could start living by it. But stuff like animism has been like taken out of it entirely, and it has a little bit of that modernist sort of feel to it, almost a little bit like, I don't know, you know, these images of from communist states where there are women and workers, and they're marching and they're modern, and there's a little bit of that kind of feeling in it, almost like, yes, the people are, but even those things that I know would have been heavily charged with ceremony, with different kinds of animist beliefs, that there's zero of it. So you see how, like, on the one hand, there's actually a lot of traditional material there, but on the other hand, it has been very much kind of almost like cleansed of the original animist material that would have been part of it. It's just an example.
Yeah, and a good example too, I'd say. It's I hadn't really thought this thought until about a minute and a half ago, so I'm going to just announce it. It doesn't happen all the time that you suddenly think of something literally for the first time, and it's this. It's a simple observation, and it passes without notice for most people, I'm sure. But on this side of the ocean, European and Christian are indistinguishable. I don't say that all Europeans are Christian then or now, of course not. But I do say that the advent of Christianity here on this side of the ocean is a European event, and it remains a European event, and they are joined at the hip, and in our collective imagination, if we have one, those things can't be torn apart for the sake of entertaining the notion of a pre-Christian Europeanism. Yeah, that's one thing. The other thing is a little closer to home, maybe, and it goes like this. It's the apropos of the proximity with which we, how should I put this? The immediacy that is colonization for us. I mean, we're living in the furrow of it, literally, all the time. And I think one of the forms it takes sort of mythically is the following. Anybody who wakes up looking like me on this continent this morning and tomorrow morning and every morning for the foreseeable wakes up manifest, if not clear, that we are not belonging. We don't know how to metabolize the not belonging. We mistake owning for belonging, of course, and made a habit of owning the joint instead of learning the joint. And that's still true. But we wake up every day in the absence of what we lost culturally, mythically, poetically, spiritually, culturally, as a result of coming here. I'll say it again. We wake up every day in the absence of what we lost by coming. So we are forever finding ourselves newly disenfranchised. Indigenous people, who are literally down the highway, down the river from where I'm sitting talking to you now, wake up every day allegedly in the same place, but of course not at all in the same place. They wake up every day in the presence of what they lost because we came. Third thing is, as soon as I say the phrase "we came," the historical alertness in me says, no, we didn't come. You came and turned into us. You meaning denizens of Europe who are still there. You came. And so in every sense that the word can really be meant, America is a European fantasy, not an American fantasy. It wasn't born here. It was born there. And it's not clear that it was ever really, that it saw the world. I think ultimately America is a stillborn proposition, a stillborn European fantasy, not a dream. I think the word fantasy is a different kind of event. And well, what do you think about that?
I think you have some really good points there, and I've been thinking about something related recently because I wanted to prepare basically a course about land connectedness, and in the process of looking at that, I became aware that of Iceland. You mentioned Iceland further because it's a really interesting case. The people who came to Iceland, they weren't joined at the hip with Christianity. They hadn't become Christian yet. So how they arrived in that place, not so very long ago actually, how they arrived at that place is very interesting. That was ceremony that began already before leaving Norway. Approaching the coast, they had specific ceremony that they were doing in order to arrive in the land. Yes. Actually getting rooted into the land, there was a complex of ceremony that they were performing. That meant that for instance, there was a man called Thorolf Mosterskeg, I think that was the guy who landed in Iceland. Immediately he starts having sacred sites, like immediately, and he performs these specific ceremony to basically create land connectedness. He then became old, he died, and was it his son or was it one of the people in his farm who basically saw him? He had a vision where he saw a mountain open, and he saw the ancestors of Thorolf sitting inside the mountain, and Thorolf was entering, meeting his ancestors. Now, what is amazing about that is that he has that level of land connectedness. He arrived in Iceland. He came from Norway. And that's the thing. He became an Icelander after actually landing there. He didn't stay a Norwegian. And when you look at Icelandic, I haven't started looking thoroughly at this yet, but I think that when you look at Icelandic place names and you compare that to American place names, then you find that Iceland is not a Norwegian fantasy that's being implemented on that island in the North Atlantic. There isn't any new Hordaland in Iceland. What happens is that the first people who come to Iceland, they start naming the place, as far as I understand. So important leader was a woman called the Deep-Minded, and so there's a place called Combs River because she lost her comb when she arrived at that river. Now that naming is comparable to ancestral beings traveling through the land in Australia and basically creating dreamlines, and that naming is building these people into the land. And I think, and this is not to say that pre-Christian peoples wouldn't have been brutal, that they wouldn't have, for instance, been murdering other people. They did that too. But they, when they arrived somewhere, land connectedness was almost instantaneous. And you also see it in other places in Northern Europe. I believe that close to Dublin there is a Cael Domer. I'm not sure of the Gaelic pronunciation there, but which is Thor's Grove, and in Gaelic. Now that is a result of, in this case, a more of an aggressive invasion where there was people living there already and a Hiberno Norse culture, and then grew up with mixed people and so on. But the thing is that it's immediate. And that is part of what you also see in the Afro-diasporic religions, where that are very similar to North European religions. The Yoruba and the Bantu, they look very much like Scandinavians inside their heads. So when they come to places like Brazil, Haiti, and Cuba, it's there are sacred places to Shango and Ogu almost immediately, and even new deities arriving or manifesting in these locations. And I've been asking myself, so how do you then heal that wound, or what can you do? Because if I were to sit down, I just borrowed a pile of books on all of this stuff, and you can sit down and you can extract some of these ceremony technologies. You can offer it to Americans, for instance, or white Americans. Then that would be a possibility to actually start becoming Americans. But then there's another question, which is, would that then be like a spiritual colonization? I guess that stuff like that should then perhaps be performed in some sort of embassy with indigenous elders, in order to basically be morally legitimate. Can you follow what I'm saying?
I think I do. Yeah. Here's one consideration. I don't know if it's in indigenous people in this continent, I should say. I don't know if it's in their best interest for us European extracted people to belong here. Now, God knows we've done harm upon harm by virtue of our inability to belong here. But I don't know if I'm overly persuaded, at least on their behalf, that us cultivating a liminal capacity to belong somewhere after all this time constitutes something that would deliver on what should have been from the beginning, from the very first time we got here, which it should have been conciliation. That's the word I would choose to describe it. by which I mean this. What should have happened if we were indeed the cultured people we imagined ourselves to be? That we would have engaged the people that we found here, first of all, as people, and not a question, a discovery, a peeling back of our geo-ignorance, let's call it. That's what it could have been, that we could have understood ourselves to be in the presence of naturally occurring equals. It was certainly available to us. It's an imagined possibility. It's not beyond, reason that it could have gone that way, but there's no sign that it really ever went that way. And so, given the fact that conciliation never took place when the likes of me and you washed up on shore here, it seems to me that the current talk about reconciliation borders on the hopelessly, unworkably premature, because there's no conciliation to replicate. There's nowhere to go back to that was better than the way we've been conducting ourselves in the last 50 years or so. Ian, I think you've got him muted.
Oh, I hear him okay. Yeah, I hear Rune okay.
Yep. Oh, I didn't hear him.
I'm just going to repeat it. No,
Sure.
it was probably myself who forgot to unmute. No, I was just saying that I think you're touching on a very huge question here that has to do with, like, how do we at all begin to deal with that level of atrocity, that level of which is colonization. Like, you probably know the stories. I'm not going to repeat them here because they are too horrific to even talk about some of them. And how do we, like, there isn't any way to balance the scales. Balancing the scales is not there. It's not an existential possibility. I suggested at some point, or made the suggestion that when we think about this, and keep in mind here that I'm not a native to this situation in the same way as you people, so take me as a little bit of a clown here sitting from the outside, but I think there is a general problem when we think about this whole thing, that we tend to implement Protestant ideas of guilt, redemption, and sin on it. These are individual yet cosmic ideas. I think that, and this is one example where we can actually look at how Vikings managed violence, or dealing with violence in communities. I think Protestantism is a major factor in messing us up inside the head. We have, for instance, we have the idea that we are eternally damned, yet also universally absolved for it at the same time. And that cognitive dissonance is deeply ingrained in all white people. Does that have some kind of alignment with the fact that exactly white people have been responsible for a disproportionate amount of morally abject behavior? I can't help suspecting it, that we are simultaneously eternally sinful, yet somehow absolved for it anyway, paradoxically. Now, that is why that, for instance, the idea of white guilt, I find that to be problematic, because guilt is that kind of a Protestant thing, and implementing that on us is, in a sense, replicating this aspect of whiteness. Now, if we look at how Vikings, for instance, or pre-Christian North Europeans dealt with violence, then they didn't try to balance the scales. Of course, there was a lot of revenge going on and all these kind of things, but they had a concept that was called mansbot, which is man payment.
Yeah. Yeah.
That if a person is murdered, then you will settle the affair by a set payment to the family. Now, there's not even a postulate that of actual satisfaction in terms of moral or emotional revenge there. There is a social convention that says, okay, that just means that we can go on living without tearing each other's throats out. And I've been thinking sometimes that the idea of actual reparation, economic reparation, in terms of, for instance, the descendants of enslaved Africans, that this could be a way of practicing something like that. We cannot undo, and we cannot aim for undoing these horrors, but we can acknowledge them. So if we move from the idea of internalized guilt and possible salvation or forgiveness and these kind of things, there is no forgiveness available for these horrors. If we move away from that and towards stuff like responsibility and respect or dealing with each other or helping each other, which could be seen as in stuff like what was I saying? Reparation, economic reparation. Then perhaps that could be a way of moving in that direction. I don't know. Just a thought.
Mm. Ian, before may I just respond to the reparation notion? Okay.
Please.
Yeah, and we all know that it's current and understandably so, as one form not just of admission, but something in the present. It's a consequential move to make in the present, and I don't know. The workability of it boggles my mind, but the thing I'm thinking about is this. I don't think that the notion of reparation works if you don't have a shared understanding amongst the parties involved that reparation constitutes a legitimate response to the historical realities. Without the shared understanding, it's not clear what it means to do it. And let me, if I could, illustrate what this might look like when it actually happens, because it not that many years ago, some version of what you described did happen here in this country. It's not more than 5 years, I think. And it worked like this. I should say that there's no photos again. The visuals are all gone. So I'm just going on audio at the moment. There we are. For some reason it disappears and now we're back. Okay. So here's what happened. The federal government of the time decided that the documented wrongs that pertain to residential school establishment and prosecution over the 1800s and well into the 1900s deserved some kind of legitimizing in terms of acknowledgement, I should say, response. And so the government established two things. First of all, they established a formal circumstance in which they overtly apologized, which from a legal liability point of view was a very risky piece of business, but so long in coming that, well, you'll see the rest of the story. So long in coming that there's consequences to the delay. And it's not all hallelujah time when it finally comes around. That delay comes around too. But anyway, so they formally apologized in the form of the Prime Minister himself, which had, I don't think, ever really happened before. And the second thing they did, which was a minor scaled thing compared to the symbolism of the apology, was to establish a fund that would in some way reimburse, I don't know what other verb to use, reimburse people who were now old, of course, late middle age or older, but had been children in this system whose lives had been unspeakably ruptured as a consequence of exposure to that whole regime. And this is somewhat anecdotal, what I'm going to tell you now. I heard about it, so I've seen no documentation, and this could be wrong. I could be exaggerating the occurrence of what I'm about to say, but from the point of view of maybe this is worth hearing. It appears that by virtue of the detonation of the pay system, that the incidence of suicide amongst the survivors increased significantly, apparently. Now, you don't want to talk literally in terms of cause and effect in something so complicated and something so subtle. But for what it's worth, just as a matter of wondering about it, is it possible that there's something about the formal acknowledgement of this thing which has so many tangible, heartbreaking shortcomings, that the shortcomings themselves become another visitation of the thing they were designed to acknowledge and to compensate for? I don't know the answer to that, but if what I say is, if it did occur in numbers that are significant enough to acknowledge it as a social consequence and not a personal, personal psychic wreckage point of view, then I'm wondering about what happens when we institutionalize what should properly be a kind of principled sorrow on the matter, and deal with, the very well-established point that you made about guilt for its own sake, guilt as an identity, sin as a precursor, not as something that ensues, but something that was always there. This notion that that wreckage is in the firmament, that transgression is the beginning, can't get responded to in any other way but more mea culpa, more, relatively speaking, kind of inexpensive mea culpas too, while we're on the subject. And I'm not talking here about money. I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm reminded of being in New Zealand not that long ago, and I was at a rich man's house. No harm intended for rich folks. They have their issues, same problems, more zeros, as they say. But he was rather proud of the fact that he'd designed and built his house according to the instruction provided him by local indigenous elders in terms of geomancy and orientation of the house to the land, and all stuff I didn't really pay attention to be honest. And then his wife related a vignette which they found laughable, not derisively, just humorous, laughable, and nowhere near on the same level of import, cultural import, as the, seeking the advice of the elders in this regard. She said, oh yeah, one time we were talking about, what we could do apropos of the last 150 years. And apparently an old woman pointed to the ground they were standing on, which these folks owned, of course, the white folks owned. And she said, well, you could begin by giving it back. And then apparently everybody just laughed like it was some kind of implausible cosmic joke that had no basis in possibility or reality. And with the laugh, everybody made good with each other apparently and continued the conversation. I suspect it wasn't a joke, which is the real joke, that it wasn't a joke, and that it was put in such a way that the host of the moment could somehow survive the instruction that was clearly available to them, and did survive it, but at the expense of realizing that it wasn't a joke.
Or it could have been a joke that served to expose a deeper truth somehow. There is a jester. There's a jester function somehow that can sometimes bring out. That old saying that it's the jester who can tell the truth to the king. But yeah, I see it. There's a strong kind of double side to that whole thing. Yeah.
Well, Rune, I'd love to weave a bit here in some of these threads that, there's this question of land and land back and belonging and, can Europeans in their wake in America even ever be Americans? And do the indigenous folk ever want them to be Americans? That was another thing. And what comes to me is this, this question about land and this question around like land more than a concept, but actually that which informs culture or that which informs identity for peoples. And I know, Stephen, like you've talked about in the school in the past, Orphan Wisdom School, one of the great primary sort of tragedies, of course, of moving indigenous people from their land to those that see land as resource and just sort of interchangeable. There's this sense, right, of, well, they can just be themselves over there, right? What's the problem? And for those that, of course, are identified and informed by the land, they can't be themselves without the land because they're interchangeable. I've heard my friend who's a sort of indigenous Haisla woman and sort of instructs settlers in a way about a lot of this stuff, and she says, we are the land being itself. That it's that intimate in a way, and so there's this sense that, well, what does belonging look like then with those that again don't belong here, right? I have in my mind some kind of fantasy in some ways, maybe generations hence, right, where the land itself sort of reclaims all who managed to stick around long enough and sort of dream them into a different dream born here. It seems to be with these big questions about what does conciliation mean, and is that the beginning of it? And I just bring this up because Rune as well, I know you've done sort of encounters and courtships with other cultures, I understand, and like South America as well, and in a way been invited in or been steeped enough in traditions that helped in a way kickstart an ancestral memory of some kind of yourself, and almost like this grafting, this like a conscious grafting of cultural ritual or initiation in a way to kind of reawaken the memory of that elsewhere for cultures that have long forgot. And so I know, Stephen, as well, that seems to be a thread that we've spoken to of, starting with the poverty, and also thankfully there's those that still, remember and practice enough to kind of inform the goneness. And I feel like perhaps we could spend the last bit of our conversation here, swimming with these questions. But yeah, I wonder either of you might feel called to speak first.
Well, I got something that I think comes directly out of what you've just said. Sorry, I didn't interrupt. Did I? Is this okay for me to go ahead for a moment? Okay.
Please.
Here's what it is. Apropos of some of the things that Rune said earlier, let's credit, beyond just acknowledging it, let's credit the notion that there's a pre-Christian Europe. Let's just start there. And then let's go further and wonder whether or not there's a rudiment, a remnant somehow of that pre-Christianity. The advent of Christianity makes everything before it into a precursor of Christianity, which of course it wasn't. None of those things were pre-Christian. The notion of pre-Christian happens with Christianity, not before it. Right? Same thing as pre-Roman and pre-literate and all that other stuff. So here's what I'm wondering then. If we can credit those two notions, that there is such a thing and that it's not utterly either fantasy or gone, then I'm wondering whether or not there's a workability afoot that a proto kind of reconciliation can and probably should take place in Europe to show the North Americans how to do it. I say that in heavy quotation marks, but why not? And I wonder whether or not there's enough distinction in Europe between that which constitutes things European and that which constitutes things monotheistic. Is there enough distinction available to the general population or to its leaders that it is thinkable that certain dominant culture institutions that trace back to the advent of Christianity can be relied upon or obliged to consider they have certain obligations to the pre-Christian inhabitants of the place. In other words, is there any way to act on the notion of an indigenous Europe? Probably we shouldn't use the word Europe at that point, but whatever I mean by the phrase indigenous Europe, is it credible that as a living reality that it could be granted a kind of status? Maybe that's what I'm asking about. What do you think?
I think it is a possibility. I think traditional knowledge, like I prefer to use the term traditional knowledge, is also in many indigenous groups. It is a work of recovery. And in European groups, some is there and some is lost and some is recovery and some is very distant. But that is the work of humanity. I think that we are in these in reflections on our past and in ongoing production of our present based on these reflections. And like when I'm, for instance, looking at traditional knowledge from a North European perspective, I'm not seeing any, for instance, scholarly reason that we shouldn't be able to think in those ways in the same level or in the same right as, for instance, indigenous groups that have been exposed to marginalization. There seems to be a little bit of this assumption, for instance, in scholarship, but also I think in popular culture, that in order to have a legitimate sort of right to think about animist heritage or traditional culture, then you have to belong to a traditional group. And that, I think, is a very problematic idea. And it's also an idea, by the way, that serves to maintain whiteness as secluded. And when we think about ways of acting on this, ways of acting on traditional knowledge, I think that we ought to first, I think that we are in a historic moment where it's available. Indigenous knowledge, for instance, is being widely acknowledged as an important cultural element in our time, in the highest level of UN summits and policy making and in popular culture and scholarship and so on. And there's no methodologically and no, theoretic or moral reason that majority populations should not have access to the same tool or should not use the same tools to decolonize themselves. So I think that it ought to be possible. Whether it will be possible is a bit of a different question. You've already seen in 2021 that a seascape in southern Spain, a place called the Mar Menor Lagoon, was granted legal rights of personhood in a way that's similar to what you have seen indigenous peoples around the world. That is just a little step. But right now, for instance, here in Denmark, where in the immediate mass of this country, there isn't an marginalized indigenous group. I'm keeping Greenland a little bit out, or Nunavut Nunaput a little bit out of this. But and that means that when, for instance, we're thinking with stuff like biodiversity, then in a UN context, it ought to be possible for us to say, well, we are working in recovery of our traditional knowledge, traditional ways of knowing, and somehow bringing this stuff back in. So I think it ought to be possible in legislation and education and so on. I'm already teaching Nordic Animism in a popular university of Copenhagen. If I am not mistaken, I might be mistaken, but if I'm not mistaken, then this is possibly the first time in Scandinavia that traditional spirituality is being taught as a legitimate position for thinking in the conventional education system. And I feel that right now the times are changing fairly quickly. And so it's not impossible that stuff like that could come from Europe. I mean, I would have expected that it probably would come from America, for the reasons I said before, that there's so much thinking and dynamism moving, but it's also possible that the connections that acknowledge these weird ruptures, that all the Irish people are sitting there saying, no, we never think about the fact that there are 26 million Irish descendants walking around, and or how many, ever many it is, it's a lot, you know. And all those people over there, we think about it every single day. It's true. It's deeply touching. But I also want to just add a little thought to what we were talking about before in this connection, and that is with the whole thing: should you become Americans, or do indigenous peoples want you to become Americans? And that is an interesting question. But first, it's difficult to ask them because there are quite a lot of people, and they probably have a lot of different opinions on it. Today, there is a global dialogue going on where a lot of indigenous voices are basically directing themselves at Eurodescendants, sort of encouraging traditional knowledge, reflection on our own cultural heritage, and a lot of us are trying in all our different, more or less corny ways to incorporate that or deal with that somehow. But I also, so that's one element that should be remembered there. But another element that I think should be remembered is, how many Eurodescendant Americans are there exactly? Are we talking about 150 million people or something like that? Or more? 200 million? I think part of this question is also considering them. Can we sit and... I mean, shouldn't we also be saying, okay, so we have 150 million people who are waking up every day feeling the how did you formulate it, the not belonging or the lostness of what we don't have. That is also a heartbreaking image, and there's a sense in which we also need to be on a human level. We need to also relate to them somehow. Or does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, to me, clearly it does. Ian, I'm going to ask you to pause things for a second. Could you do that?
Sure. Yep.
And I'll come right back because human necessity has overtaken my will. I'll be right back.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. We'll I mean, you and I can perhaps ruminate just a little while we're waiting on that
Okay.
moment. Yeah, Rune. But maybe one thing I could highlight, with those questions hanging in the air too, is I know that you spent time with I think it's called finfaring, right? Was the term of it there? And not to, I know this is a huge vein to get into, but again, just around this question of kind of like kickstarting kind of, these kind of rememberings into presence through the presence of other cultural traditions still more or less intact, and how important that seems to be, rather than a kind of standing start, for others that have fully lost the threads, for example. So I just wonder again, just a bit of rumination on that while we just take a moment. I'm sure he'll be back very soon.
Yeah. I should have knitted that into what I was just saying there, because you were asking about that. Like, I studied and also in some level immersed in Afro-Brazilian spirituality. Now, these people have developed, I think, an incredible capacity to build counterpoints to modernity, an incredible capacity. And I don't know if the reason is that they were in very close a relation of oppression, by the way, with modernity. But I think that the particularly the Afro-diasporic spiritualities have built what you could almost call ontological safe spaces, like a reality bubble that they build, where very powerful animist realities is still, and technologies are still being used. And like because I immersed in that during my studies, I had that way of thinking when I started reflecting on my own background again. And it's not always completely visible if you look at, for instance, my YouTube channel. But what I'm really, in a sense, trying to do is to try to think about my own cultural heritage in the same way as a candomblé priestess think about her Yoruba heritage, right? And that has tools in it to open stuff like cultural resilience that you're seeing. For instance, the ways that in medieval times people would merge Christian saints with heathen gods, and that has then been part of their way of building cultural resilience and bringing on parts of their culture. And so that's just one example, which is it's iconically well known, that in religion like Santeria, you'll have these identifications between West African deities and saints. But it's also in I think deep levels of how you talk about and think about reality. And I think that these people, like particularly the Yoruba, they will be remembered in centuries that come, like we remember today the Greeks and the Babylonians, for as main contributors to the culture of the coming ages, where we are moving towards a decolonial future, because there's such effective decolonial tools in it. And you even see indigenous Americans actually using it. But yeah, no, I could talk about that for hours.
Thanks, Rune. Yeah, Stephen, I just had touched him on again a bit further example of this idea of in a way his immersion within a cultural frame, was able to then pour it over and kind of reawaken a capacity there. In many ways, perhaps to also answer your question, how does the Europeans kind of go do it first, just to kind of show the North Americans what's up. But I wonder, many threads in the air, and we're hitting the time-ish that we put for us, and I'm enjoying this, and I want to respect everyone's time as well. But I wonder if you could respond in a way that what's still got you from this part of the conversation.
Yeah, it's vast business, isn't it? And we won't live to see the consequences of even the things that are underway now, never mind the nascent elements of them all. So I'll end the way I began, with a couple of little vignettes of things that occurred, both of which occurred in Iceland, as it happens, since that seems to be a bit of a nodal point for what we've been talking about. So I was teaching Beowulf in Iceland, which seemed entirely compelling an idea to undertake. We were way up in the north of the country. We're nowhere near Reykjavik and the Golden Circle and all of that. And two things took place there. One of them was, we had with us a magician, and he was a remarkable magician, I have to say, and probably still is. And his sleight of hand and his how he made people so suggestible. It was really a thing to behold. So anyway, we're way up in the north of the country. So these people are not English speaking for the most part. And although they got their utensils and their gizmos and so on, they're clearly country people. And are they indigenously country people? Well, let's see what the story indicates to you. So we were going back and forth with sort of songs that we knew when we were the last evening we were all together, if I remember right, and it was enjoyable. In fact, it was a dry part of the country, so I actually had to bring wine in from out of the zone, and the wine had an interesting consequence, almost a communion consequence. in that people became more amenable to the possibilities of each other than they might have been when a certain degree of propriety was maintained. And in the course of this, the magician cut loose with his stuff, and he wowed people. But there was the oldest man. He spoke through the interpreter, and he said, "Your friend." He directed this to me as the ostensible boss of the operation. He says, "Your friend has some amazing skill, but you must tell him that he has to be careful." And then there was a long pause where everybody in the room, on their side of the room, was kind of they were ill at ease suddenly, not because of what he was saying, but by virtue of what he was saying. He said, you tell your friend he needs to be careful because he's playing with fire. And this event I'm describing to you happened within 200 yards of the last documented place where witches were burned in Iceland in the 1600s. And there were 3 men that were burned at the stake in this little crevasse down sort of below sea level. And the place is still available to witness, and there's no markings of any kind. There's no historical plaques, but all the locals know that that's what happened. So, I mean, it's more than apparent to me, at least, that those days of witch burnings are not entirely in the mythic past, that the consciousness that gave rise to them and that ensued from them is still more than available to the local people. And without much hesitation and with a little prompting of the elixir of life, there they were. It was quite remarkable. And he wasn't saying it as a forbidding voice. He was genuinely concerned for the well-being of this young man and his magic. That was one story. The other story that took place is I had read, probably very similar to what Rune had read in terms of the ritualizing around the Norse people approaching Iceland for the first time. And as I recall, one of the sections was they had things on board their boats that nobody has been able to figure out, either architecturally or nautically, what they were. They know what the word is, but they don't know exactly what it designated. So the best they translated in the English that I've read is something like altar posts. And so apparently they come into visual sight of the land, and the way they petition the local gods for some kind of entry or blessing or tolerance is to tip their prized possession, these altar posts, into the water, and then track what the fortunes of tide and everything else does to them. And if they make landfall, and where they make landfall, the Norse translated as an indication that the local gods have indicated that's where they should land as well. And that apparently was the beginning. So knowing all of this, in the days beforehand, I made connection with local boat owners and a local carver, a wood and stone carver, and a practitioner of a lot of traditional arts, and commissioned him to make, best as he could figure it out, what these 2 posts might be. And he did. And the day when all the North Americans came, or mostly North Americans, maybe Europeans were with us as well, from the UK and otherwise, we all assembled on the shore. And then the sea captain that I had spoken to about these matters and his brother, the carver, released these into the water, dipped them into the water. And we're basically recreating as best as we could figure out with scant information those days, those moments, as a precursor to what I was proposing to teach about Beowulf on this piece of ground in the North Atlantic. And they did make landfall, and we did carry them in, and they were like 600 pounds a piece. They were enormous things. And they set them up on either side of the place I was supposed to sit while I was teaching. And there they sat. But the beautiful PS is this: when we were done and most of the people had gone home, we put these 2 temple posts or altar posts. They were carved. One was Thor, and who's the other one, Natalie? Odin. That's correct. Yeah. And we brought them way up north to the site of the very contentious possibility that a hydroelectric dam was going to be built across one of these glacial melt, excuse me, meltways. And it was a foreign company that was doing it, maybe a Canadian company if my memory serves. And the whole thing was tearing the local people apart. We went up there. I basically left it to the locals. I said, do with it as you see fit. And what they did was they mounted these two gods facing the direction of the proposed hydroelectric dam, glowering in that direction. And that's the last I saw of them. There they were, part of the countryside again, driftwood that had ceased to drift and was now in some adamant way laying a claim upon the near future and all these negotiations. I'm not saying I played any part in that other than the coordination of it all, but to be a witness to it was quite remarkable. And the local people tell me that they're still there and the contention remains.
Wow, nice story there. I understand that we should probably end soon, but let me just add one little thing, because we've been talking about here the relation between Europe and America, and it strikes me that Iceland is in a sense a middle point, not only geographically but also historically. Iceland is composed actually by part North American continental foundation and partly European, and at the place where these two meet, that is where I think that is where the Thingvellir is, where actually the Icelandic parliament used to congregate. And this whole thing about Iceland as actually a very new settlement, but having this, like you're describing, this very strong sense of land connectivity, where, for instance, contemporary building projects will face strong resistance from local populations because of spirit places. Basically, that is something you don't find in mainland Scandinavia, and that's remarkable that this rather new settlement actually has that very deep connectivity. So yeah, I just want to suggest the possibility that perhaps Iceland is could be a dynamo for this modern future that perhaps we could wish for.
P.S. I am told by locals that in the last half dozen years, or maybe a little longer, the Icelandic parliament, if that's what it is called, has decriminalized paganism or animism formally.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's a fairly big part of, or it's fairly big in Iceland, contemporary paganism.
Wow. Well, I'm left with gratitude to you both for the time today from very vast parts of this planet, tuning in somehow with this technology, and that image, Stephen, of the two gods, Odin, Thor, just glowering. I use that word, glowering at this, encroaching, technocratic, maw, but somehow, willing to face in the seas. And yeah, what a beautiful image here to leave us with. Thanks to the audience that tuned in. There actually was some beautiful comments that were accompanying a lot of the conversation, so thank you for that. And I just want to say a word or two about the where to find, of course, more from both of my guests. And first, you have Nordic Animism, if you want to connect with Rune, who has a pretty extensive YouTube channel, with lots of really incredible offerings that he gives up for those to connect with his work and the tracks of his research and experience. And then, of course, orphanwisdom.com, where you can find a lot of Stephen's work, links to the books, number of interviews, short films that I've done, contributed to, and I believe the latest of the tour, the Nights in Grief and Mystery tour, which this might be a momentary reprieve, perhaps, but the road might be calling soon. Maybe a word, Stephen. But maybe a word too about the next phase of that journey, and then we call.
We're in Canada, which is unusual for us.
Okay.
Starting in the west and going down a little bit into California and Oregon, I think in that zone, coming back to Ontario a little bit, a little reprieve, as you've adequately described it, and then off to New Zealand and Australia to the middle of, for about a month, I think, middle of November to the middle of December, and then collapse in a heap of ruin thereafter.
Wow. Well, get tickets if you can. It's a phenomenal show that is ever changing as well. And I think surfaces so much of what, was in conversation here today. So once again, thank you both.
Thank you both.
Thanks. Super nice to meet you, Stephen, and to talk to you again, Ian.
Ciao for now. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Crow's Nest. Please consider writing a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing this episode with your friends. To learn more about the School of Mythopoetics and attend our upcoming events, visit schoolofmythopoetics.com.